A quick content warning before we begin. Parts of this episode touch on difficult subjects, including abortion, domestic violence, and attempted suicide. We hold these moments with care, but they're part of Marlon Brando's story, and we want you to know before going in. Thank you. Monterey, December 1958. More than 100 members of a film crew are scattered across the California coastline, waiting. Some lean against the equipment, watching the seals move through the water offshore. Others talk quietly, passing the time however they can. They've been waiting like this for hours. The scene they're all here to film is simple. A man sits alone on a rock, looking out at the ocean. There's no dialogue, no action, really. Nothing that should take very long at all. The shot is already framed. The equipment is in place. The cameras are ready. The crew is ready. And Marlon Brando, the man they're here to film, is already sitting on the rock. All he has to do is look out at the water. But action hasn't been called. The camera still isn't rolling. Because Brando, the director as well as the star, is waiting for a wave. Not just any wave, the right wave. He has something specific in mind. He wants the surf behind him to rise and break a certain way. The ocean behind him needs weight, movement, something powerful enough to match whatever is happening inside the man sitting in front of it. And until the ocean gives him the image he wants, no one is going anywhere. The film in question is One-Eyed Jacks, Brando's directorial debut. And only a few weeks ago, he wasn't supposed to be directing it at all. Stanley Kubrick had originally been hired for the job, with Brando set to star. It had seemed like an ideal pairing, one of the most exciting young directors in Hollywood, working with one of its most instinctive actors. Then, the disagreements began. The script, the direction of the story, the casting. The longer the two worked together, the clearer it became that they saw pretty much everything about the film differently. The disagreements reached a breaking point. Kubrick left, with shooting only weeks away. Someone had to direct it, so Brando took the job himself. In some ways, it made perfect sense. He'd already changed American acting by refusing to do what was expected, searching for something true inside every scene and pushing until he found it. And now, he has the freedom to shape an entire film around that instinct. But that freedom also means that, for the first time, there's no one standing over him. No one to tell him the shot is good enough. No one to tell him when to rein it in. Around him, the company waits. The equipment stays in place. And Brando keeps watching the ocean. Eventually, the camera will roll. After hours and hours of waiting. The whole day will be lost. A full day of shooting, wasted, on Brando's quest for the perfect wave. And this is only the beginning. Moments like this will keep adding up. It will cause the schedule to double, the budget to triple, and the film to be taken away by the studio funding it. It will be cut down, the ending will be changed, and Marlon Brando will never direct another picture. But none of that has happened yet. Right now, on the Monterey coast, it's all just beginning. Because Brando has finally won the complete freedom to make a film on his own terms. And as more than 100 people wait for the ocean to give him what he wants, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. Marlon Brando and complete freedom might not be the best combination. Welcome to When They Were Making It. I'm your host, Patrick Rankin, and this is the podcast that dives deep into the glorious, often messy, and utterly human stories behind Hollywood's greatest films and the legends who created them. This is part 2 of our 3-part series on Marlon Brando. Today, we're exploring what came after Hollywood crowned the actor who changed movie acting, and how, over the next 15 years, he would fight the industry, the image, and the expectations that had grown around his name, while navigating a personal life that would become increasingly complicated, chaotic, and fractured. There's a strange thing that happens when someone reaches the top. For years, everything has a direction. Every rejection gives something to fight. Every obstacle gives something to push against. The climb continues because somewhere above is the thing that's been promised, the thing that will make all of it worthwhile. And then, one day, there's nowhere left to climb. The applause fades, the room empties, morning comes, and the same memories are still there, the same grief, the same restlessness. Only now, there's an award sitting nearby, telling the world the climb was worth it. For Marlon Brando, that morning came in the spring of 1955. He was 30 years old. He had received 4 consecutive Academy Award nominations. He had changed American acting, become one of the most famous men in the world, and finally won the Oscar Hollywood had spent years preparing to give him. If reaching the top was supposed to make everything worthwhile, Brando was there now, and it hadn't. He had the leverage, he had the platform, he had the name. What he didn't have was any clear idea of what he wanted to do with any of it. Fresh off his Oscar win, he created Pennebaker Productions, a company designed to give him control over the films he made, the stories he told, and the terms on which he worked. He named it after his mother. Then he put his father in charge. Marlon Brando Sr., the man who had spent years telling his son he would never amount to anything, was installed as president of a company built entirely on that same son's success. It was a striking choice. Brando had already entrusted much of his financial life to his father before. The money he'd made over the past several years had been poured into Penny Poke, the Nebraska cattle ranch Marlon Sr. managed on his behalf. And by 1955, the venture had unraveled, taking a significant chunk of Brando's earnings with it. But money had always remained strangely abstract to Brando, something he earned in enormous sums, spent without much thought, and left other people to manage. The collapse of Penny Poke had done little to change that. So rather than take control of the money himself, Brando handed his father another business to run. Brando's friend and Pennebaker board member, George England, believed the arrangement carried more than a little unresolved history. In England's view, placing Marlon Sr. beneath him reversed the old balance of power, giving the son a chance to demean and diminish, as England put it, the man who had spent years doing the same to him. Whatever else may have been buried inside the arrangement, Brando had larger ambitions for Pennebaker. He imagined the company as more than a way to protect his independence. He wanted the freedom to pursue stories he believed in, including, eventually, hopefully, films that confronted social injustice rather than simply turning his image into a product. In Brando's mind, Pennebaker represented a way out, a chance to step beyond the machinery of Hollywood and build something that answered to his own values rather than to Hollywood's expectations. But before Brando could build the future he imagined, Hollywood was waiting with another role. And this one came with songs. Marlon Brando's first film after winning the Academy Award would be Guys and Dolls. Guys and Dolls had been one of Broadway's biggest hits, a Damon Runyon musical comedy about gamblers, showgirls, and the Salvation Army in 1940s New York. It had opened in 1950, won 5 Tony Awards, including Best Musical, and run for 1,200 performances. Samuel Goldwyn had bought the rights and wanted to turn it into a major Hollywood production. For the role of Sky Masterson, the male lead, Goldwyn initially wanted Gene Kelly, but MGM refused to loan him out. So Goldwyn turned to Marlon Brando. Brando was not known for singing, dancing, or musical comedy, but he was one of the biggest draws in Hollywood. And to Samuel Goldwyn, that was what mattered most. Director Joseph L. Mankiewicz had worked with Brando on Julius Caesar and knew how to get him to say yes. He sent a wire. "You have never done a musical, neither have I." He persuaded Brando to treat the role as another challenge, a chance to attempt something neither of them had done before. For an actor determined not to repeat himself, that was reason enough. Brando threw himself into the preparation. He worked with vocal coaches, studied the mechanics of singing, approaching the role as another technical challenge to solve. And as the rest of the production began to fall into place, another name joined the cast: Frank Sinatra. Sinatra would play Nathan Detroit, a fast-talking gambler whose endless engagement to nightclub singer Miss Adelaide formed the story's comic center. The second lead to Brando's romantic hero. Sinatra didn't like it. Sinatra had signed on to Guys and Dolls at a professional high. After years of decline, the film From Here to Eternity had helped him complete one of the great comebacks in Hollywood history, earning him an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor and returning him to the top of both the film and music worlds. He believed he should have the lead, and made no secret of his resentment. But there was something deeper at play. The wound was familiar. A year earlier, Sinatra had been in position to play Terry Malloy in On the Waterfront, attending costume fittings, expecting the role. Before Brando signed, Sinatra was pushed out, and Brando won the Oscar. Now, in a musical, Sinatra once again found himself playing second to the same man. The tension between them was not only personal. They approached the work in completely different ways. On the first day of rehearsals, Brando approached Sinatra and asked if they could run lines together. He was new to musicals and wanted to prepare. Sinatra's response was blunt. "Don't give me any of that actor's studio shit." the two men kept their distance. Where Brando wanted to rehearse, experiment, and keep searching until a scene felt right, Sinatra preferred to arrive prepared, hit his marks, and move on. He disliked repeated takes and had little patience for the kind of exploration and rehearsal Brando considered essential. When Mumbles is through rehearsing, he reportedly told Mankiewicz, "I'll come out." The gloves came off quickly. Reportedly, during one scene, Brando and Sinatra were seated together at a table with plates of cheesecake in front of them. Brando not only knew that Sinatra hated repeated takes, he knew that Sinatra hated cheesecake. So Brando began making mistakes. Take after take, the scene had to be reset and done again. And each time, Sinatra was forced to eat a little more cheesecake. Eventually, after enough takes that Sinatra said he couldn't eat another bite, they wrapped for the day. The next morning, apparently finished having his fun, Brando returned to set and nailed the scene in a single take. He would later say of Sinatra, "Frank's the kind of guy who, when he gets to heaven, is going to give God a hard time for making him bald." It was a pointed jab at Sinatra's well-known sensitivity about his thinning hair. Guys and Dolls opened in November 1955 and became one of the year's biggest commercial hits. It got mostly positive reviews, but Brando's singing was not one of the things people praised. Critics were polite about it at best, with Time noting that he sometimes tends to be flat. The show's composer, Frank Lesser, was even less forgiving. He reportedly disliked the film's casting so much that he refused to watch it for the rest of his life. Brando collected his paycheck and moved on. But before he did, he met the woman who would become his first wife. By the mid-1950s, Marlon Brando's romantic life, much like the rest of his life, had already been complicated for years. Women, and by his own later account, men, drifted in and out. Some stayed for months, some for years, some did not stay at all. There was Movita Castaneda, a Mexican-American actress about 8 years Brando's senior, whom he had first met during the making of Viva Zapata in 1951. There was Rita Moreno, a 22-year-old Puerto Rican actress whom he had met during the making of Desiree in 1954. There was Josanne Mariani, a young French woman he met in New York in late 1953. This relationship quickly became serious, and in 1954, they announced their engagement. It was called off in 1955. And there was still Ellen Adler, his acting teacher Stella's daughter, who had been in Brando's life since he was 20 years old. Their romance had never settled into anything stable, but neither had it disappeared. He returned to her again and again, and long after the relationship itself changed, the connection endured. Some who knew Brando would later describe Ellen as one of the great loves of his life. But there was another relationship that resisted easy definition. Wally Cox. Cox was Brando's childhood friend, the boy he had defended on a playground, the roommate he had briefly lived with in New York, and one of the few people who had known him before the fame, and before it changed the terms of almost every relationship around him. By now, Cox was famous in his own right, the star of the television comedy Mr. Peepers. The two men lived near one another in Los Angeles and remained extraordinarily close. Brando would later speak openly about having relationships with men, though he resisted conventional labels like bisexuality. And whether his relationship with Cox was romantic or sexual was never established. Brando never defined it publicly, and even those who knew them disagreed. What was never in doubt was how deeply Brando loved him. In the years after his mother's death, Cox remained one of the few constants in Brando's life, someone who knew the person beneath everything the world had made Marlon Brando into. If Wally had been a woman, Brando once said, I would have married him, and we would have lived happily ever after. But Wally was not the person Brando married. Anna Kashfi was. Kashfi was 21 years old, dark-haired, and strikingly beautiful. She had been born in Calcutta, she said. Her father, she also said, was an Indian architect named Devi Kashfi. Kashfi had arrived in Hollywood just weeks earlier, signed to MGM, and was already being positioned as an exotic new screen presence. The press called her the Grace Kelly of India. Brando met her in the Paramount commissary in September 1955. The attraction was immediate. He introduced himself, waited a few weeks, then called and asked her to dinner. Over the course of the evening, his curiosity about her became fascination. Kashfi seemed unlike anyone Brando had known before. Poised, worldly, and carrying stories of India and a life far removed from the Hollywood circles he knew so well. Over the months that followed, they began seeing more and more of each other. And Brando moved on to another film, The Tea House of the August Moon. It was an MGM comedy adapted from a Pulitzer Prize-winning play about American occupation forces in post-war Okinawa. Brando played Sakini, a local interpreter who runs circles around the well-meaning but hapless Americans sent to modernize his village. Like Guys and Dolls, the role gave Brando a chance to work in a lighter register than audiences were used to seeing from him, this time playing with comedy. He spent 2 months preparing, studying Okinawan culture, and building Sakini through voice, movement, and physical detail. Brando appeared beneath heavy makeup and prosthetics intended to make him look Japanese, while adopting an accent and mannerisms to complete the effect. At the time, the casting drew little to no scrutiny. White actors playing Asian characters were still widely acceptable in Hollywood. Reviews focused instead on Brando's performance, praising its charm and comic lightness, though some were less convinced. Bosley Crowther of the New York Times found him too elaborate, too consciously cute, calling Sakini less a charming rascal than a calculated clown. Brando himself would later say he was miscast, not because of the racial transformation required, but because he and fellow co-star Glenn Ford were so absorbed in their individual performances that they never actually acted together. He called it a horrible picture. By this time, Brando's production company, Pennebaker, was still struggling to turn his ambitions into actual films. Projects had been optioned, rewritten, and abandoned, while the company spent money without yet putting a picture into production. In the meantime, Brando was beginning to look elsewhere in Hollywood for stories that reflected the kind of work he wanted to make. Sayonara, which began filming in 1956, was one of them. Adapted from James Michener's novel, The film centered on an American Air Force officer who falls in love with a Japanese woman, at a time when interracial marriage remained illegal across much of the United States. As the civil rights movement began to gain momentum in America, questions of racial discrimination were starting to occupy more of Brando's attention. Sayonara gave him a way to confront them on screen. He became deeply invested in the film's central relationship. In the original novel, the romance ends in separation. Brando believed that was too easy, another story in which prejudice was allowed to win. So he pushed for the ending to be changed. Instead of walking away from one another, the couple would choose to marry and face the consequences together. The filmmakers agreed. Sayonara opened in December 1957 and became one of the biggest successes of Brando's career. The film dominated the box office and received 10 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture and another Best Actor nomination for Brando. It would go on to win 4, although Brando lost Best Actor to Alec Guinness for The Bridge on the River Kwai. But while Brando was in Kyoto making Sayonara, another portrait of him was taking shape. In January 1957, Truman Capote arrived at the Miyako Hotel to interview him for The New Yorker. Brando had spent much of his career keeping the press at a distance. He avoided Hollywood's gossip columnists, figures like Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons, and resisted the machinery that turned actors' private lives into public entertainment. But Capote was different. What was meant to be a conversation about the film stretched late into the night. And Brando talked about his childhood, his parents, his loneliness, his growing dissatisfaction with acting. At 32, he was one of the most famous actors in the world, known to the public as the rebellious, instinctive genius who had turned American acting upside down. But in Kyoto, with Capote, he spoke openly about the doubts growing behind the success, and about what any of it had come to mean to him. He told Capote that acting no longer satisfied him, and that he was never even certain it was what he wanted from life in the first place. The work had made him famous. It had made him rich, but it had not given him the sense of purpose he had expected to find. He was increasingly impatient with the machinery around it, the publicity, the repetition, the pressure to keep performing versions of himself for people he did not know. He had everything an actor was supposed to want: fame, money, power, the freedom to choose his own work. And none of it had answered the question underneath it. What was any of it for? Brando didn't have an answer, but increasingly, he was looking beyond acting for one. By the fall of 1957, Anna Kashfi was pregnant, and Marlon Brando was about to become a husband. For years, Brando had resisted commitment in any form, especially marriage. But now, with a child on the way, his relationship with Kashfi could no longer remain undefined. On October 11th, 1957, they married at Brando's aunt's home in Eagle Rock, Los Angeles. The ceremony was small and private. No parents on either side attended. She was 23, he was 33. For one of Hollywood's most famously elusive bachelors, the marriage was news enough. But that news was about to be overshadowed completely. Within 24 hours, The story Anna Kashfi had told about herself had begun to unravel. The press had located a man named William Patrick O'Callaghan in Cardiff, Wales. He identified himself as Anna Kashfi's father, and he had a statement to make. His daughter, he said, was not Indian. She was not the daughter of an Indian architect named Devi Kashfi. She was Joan O'Callaghan, born in Wales, raised in Wales, with no Indian blood whatsoever. The headlines arrived the next morning. Kashfi called Welsh. Kashfi still enigma. The woman Brando had just married, the woman Hollywood had been calling the Grace Kelly of India, was being accused of having invented herself entirely. Kashfi maintained her version of events. She was not, she insisted, simply a Welsh factory worker's daughter who had fabricated an exotic identity for Hollywood. Her father, she said, was not O'Callaghan. He was her stepfather. Her real father was an Indian architect. She had Indian blood. The story was more complicated than the tabloids were making it. The truth, as it turned out, was more complicated than either side allowed. It was concluded in later years that the O'Callaghans were Anglo-Indian, a mixed-race family with roots in India going back generations, who may have had strong reasons in post-war Britain to downplay that heritage. The simple narrative of a Welsh woman who invented an Indian identity obscured something considerably more layered. But in October 1957, the story the press ran with was simple. Brando had married a fraud. It compounded troubles in a marriage that was already doomed from the start. Brando would later admit that he only married Kashfi because she was pregnant. He had spent his adult life avoiding exactly this kind of commitment, so he carried on with other women like he hadn't made one. His career kept him perpetually elsewhere, and Kashfi, whose Hollywood career had been effectively destroyed overnight, now watching her husband continue seeing other women, found herself isolated and increasingly volatile. By multiple accounts, the relationship was marked by physical and verbal violence on both sides. Brando's secretary, Alice Marchek, later described furniture thrown, a table hurled through a plate glass window. Into this, their son, Christian Devi Brando, was born on May 11th, 1958. Brando had spent much of his life trying to outrun the damage his own father had done. Now he was a father himself. And almost immediately, the family he had created began to come apart. As he had been absent from the marriage, he was often absent from fatherhood. Within months of Christian's birth, he and Kashfi had separated. Throughout all of this, his professional life had continued moving forward, almost indifferently. Earlier that year, in April 1958, The Young Lions had opened. Adapted from Irwin Shaw's best-selling novel, the film followed 3 soldiers through the Second World War. Brando played Christian Diestel, a German officer whose faith in the Nazi cause gradually gives way to disillusionment. The character had been much harsher in Shaw's novel. Brando pushed to make him more human, less a fixed symbol of evil than an ordinary man drawn into something monstrous, then forced to confront what he had become part of. He spent nearly 15 hours arguing his case to the filmmakers. They agreed. Just like on Sayonara, Brando was using the power his success had given him to push the work towards something he believed had meaning. It was a sense of purpose he seemed increasingly unable to find anywhere else, including in his own family. In March 1959, Anna Kashfi filed for divorce. The marriage had lasted less than 2 years, but ending it did not end the conflict between them. Instead, it gave it a new focus: baby Christian. Kashfi initially retained custody. Brando was granted visitation. What followed was not a clean separation, but the beginning of a custody battle that would continue in one form or another for more than a decade. Kashfi wanted to retain custody of Christian. Brando wanted a greater role in his son's life, first through expanded visitation, and eventually through custody himself. It got messy quickly. Each accused the other of being an unfit parent. Kashfi pointed to Brando's absences, his affairs, and the instability of his life. Brando increasingly questioned whether Kashfi could provide Christian with a stable home. The disputes returned them to court again and again, and at the center of it all was a child not yet a year old. While Brando's personal life was becoming increasingly unstable, his professional life had already started following suit. Since 1957, Pennebaker had been developing the project that would become its first major film. That year, the company had acquired the rights to The Authentic Death of Henry Jones, a novel by Charles Nider and loosely inspired by the story of Billy the Kid. Brando would play Rio, a man who escapes from prison and sets out to find the partner who abandoned him years earlier. Paramount had agreed to finance and distribute the film, which would be renamed One-Eyed Jacks. The setting would be moved from New Mexico to the California coast, but the central conflict remained the same: two outlaws, once partners, divided by betrayal. The project itself was ambitious: a large-scale Western built around Brando, developed through his own company, with an unusual degree of creative and financial control placed in his hands. For years, he had pushed directors and producers to reshape the films around him. Now, for the first time, he would have the power to shape one from the beginning. And throughout 1958, he did. Brando brought to the project the same restless search for something true that had defined his best work as an actor. But now, that search extended beyond his own performance, into the script, the casting, the characters, and the meaning of the film itself. Every decision opened another possibility, and every possibility gave Brando another reason to keep looking. The screenplay became the first sticking point. Rod Serling, soon to become the creator of The Twilight Zone, had already written an early adaptation, which had been rejected. Sam Peckinpah, years away from becoming one of the defining directors of the American Western, developed his own version of the story. Brando responded enthusiastically to his script, and for a time, the project seemed to have found its shape. But as Brando's ideas about the project continued to evolve, and more people were brought on board with their own ideas, the script and its writers kept changing. Peckinpah was eventually let go. Novelist and screenwriter Calder Willingham was brought on. When that didn't work out, screenwriter Guy Trosper was hired. By this time, Brando had already chosen the director for what had become an ever-evolving story, a young director named Stanley Kubrick. Kubrick was only 29, but his 1957 film Paths of Glory, a stark anti-war drama, had not only established him as one of the most formidable new filmmakers in Hollywood, but also as someone who understood exactly the kind of morally complicated filmmaking Brando wanted to do. For months, the two worked closely on the project, revising the script, debating the characters, and trying to decide what kind of Western they were making. But the longer they worked, the more difficult it became to separate collaboration from control. Kubrick wanted a leaner, more disciplined film. Brando kept pushing to broaden it, toward the emotional consequences of betrayal, and toward a version of the character Rio that could not be reduced to hero or villain. The disagreements reached into nearly every part of the production. Casting became one of the clearest fault lines. Kubrick wanted Spencer Tracy to play Dad Longworth, Rio's former partner and the man who had left him behind. Brando wanted Karl Malden. Malden was a close friend, a trusted collaborator since Brando's Broadway days, and already part of the Pennebaker orbit. Kubrick balked, but Brando would not give up. By the fall of 1958, the differences between Brando and Kubrick had become increasingly difficult to resolve. In November, with just weeks until filming was set to begin, Kubrick left the film. Publicly, he was moving on to develop an adaptation of Vladimir Nabokov's controversial novel Lolita, but few believed scheduling was the real story. Pennebaker was now left scrambling. With locations already chosen, a cast assembled, and a large amount of money committed. What it no longer had was a director. Karl Malden was briefly considered for the job. He declined. So Brando stepped in himself. Brando had never directed a film before. In practical terms, taking over meant assuming responsibility for an enormous production with almost no preparation. Creatively, it meant something else. For the first time, there would be no director standing between Brando and the film he imagined. Filming began in December 1958 on the Monterey coast, and Brando approached directing much as he approached acting. He worked closely with the other actors, encouraged improvisation, and kept searching for moments that felt spontaneous rather than planned. But directing required decisions on a scale acting never had. Every performance, not just his own, every camera angle, every location, every cut. And Brando approached each of them with the same instinct he always had. Keep searching until something feels true. The problem was that, on a production this large, the search had a cost. During one of the first scenes filmed at the beach, a relatively simple shot of Rio sitting alone on a rock brought production to a standstill while Brando watched the ocean, unwilling to begin until the waves behind him carried the weight he believed the moment needed. A shot that should have taken less than an hour consumed most of the day. One production day largely gone. And it quickly became clear that this was not an isolated instance. By the time production was 5 days old, it was already 2 weeks behind schedule. And by the time it finally wrapped, in June 1959, the 3-month shoot had doubled to 6. The budget had nearly tripled, from roughly $1.8 million to between $5 and $6. and they had roughly 1 million feet of film. Now, Brando had to turn all of it into a movie. And he proved no better at settling in the editing room than he had on set. As the editing dragged through the second half of 1959, so did the fallout from his divorce from Anna Kashfi. It was costing him money One-Eyed Jacks was not yet earning. So he divided his time between Los Angeles, where he continued shaping the film in the editing room, and New York, where he made The Fugitive Kind for director Sidney Lumet, a role he would later admit he took largely for the money. Eventually, after months of cutting and recutting, Brando arrived at a version of One-Eyed Jacks he was prepared to show Paramount. It was the film he had been searching for through every rewrite, every delayed decision, every additional take, and every month spent in the editing room. His version, his vision. And it ran 4 hours and 42 minutes. Paramount was stunned and responded accordingly. There was no way in hell they were going to release a 5-hour Western. So they took the film away from him. By the time Paramount was finished, One-Eyed Jacks ran 2 hours and 21 minutes, half the length of Brando's original cut. Brando would later complain that the studio had turned characters he intended to be gray and human into something closer to heroes and villains. But it was, by then, out of his hands. One-Eyed Jacks opened in New York on March 30th, 1961. The response was divided. Some critics admired the film's visual beauty, ambition, and unusual psychological depth. Others found it slow, self-indulgent, and overlong even in its reduced form. The film failed to earn enough for Paramount to recoup its investment. Brando had spent years fighting for the right to make films on his own terms. The culmination of that fight, One-Eyed Jacks, had given him that chance. And to anyone watching from the outside, he blew it. Marlon Brando would never direct another film. By the time One-Eyed Jacks reached theaters in 1961, Brando's first marriage was over. But his private life had not become any simpler. The custody battle over Christian was still unfolding. Kashfi retained primary custody, while Brando continued pushing for greater access to his son. Meanwhile, Movita Castaneda, the actress Brando had first met nearly a decade earlier during Viva Zapata, had remained in his life through much of the chaos. In 1960, they had married, privately. The following year, their son, Miko, was born. Brando was now a husband again, and the father of 2 sons, growing up in separate households. Meanwhile, his next film was already underway. Mutiny on the Bounty. The story was one Hollywood knew well. Based on the real-life mutiny aboard the British naval ship HMS Bounty in 1789, it followed the growing conflict between the ship's tyrannical captain, William Bligh, and his second-in-command, Fletcher Christian, a conflict that ends with Christian leading the crew in rebellion and taking control of the ship. MGM had filmed the story once before, in 1935. That version, starring Charles Laughton as Bligh and Clark Gable as Christian, had been one of the studio's great prestige successes, a major box office hit and winner of the Academy Award for Best Picture. Now, MGM wanted to make it again. Bigger, more expensive, and built for the era of the widescreen epic. The studio imagined the remake as its Ben-Hur of 1961, a sweeping production shot partly in Tahiti, with a full-scale replica of the Bounty and Marlon Brando as Fletcher Christian. Brando also had another major offer on the table: the lead in Colombia's epic Lawrence of Arabia, set to film around the same time. But that film meant months in the desert. Mutiny on the Bounty meant Tahiti. Brando chose Tahiti. The deal was also enormous: a salary of $500,000, a percentage of the profits, and additional pay if the production ran beyond schedule. Brando began filming in late November 1960, joining a production already echoing many of the problems that had plagued One-Eyed Jacks: delays, uncertainty, and a screenplay that was still being rewritten. Brando reportedly arrived on set with strong ideas about how the film should be made, and more specifically, about how Fletcher Christian should be played. He wanted Christian to be morally complex, not Gable's romantic hero of the 1935 version, but something more ambiguous and difficult. The director, Carol Reed, the British filmmaker behind the acclaimed noir The Third Man, had his own ideas about the story. Before long, tensions developed between Reed, Brando, and a studio already under pressure over the film's mounting delays. By early 1961, MGM dismissed Reed from the production. His replacement was Louis Milestone, a veteran director with 2 Academy Awards to his name. But Milestone fared no better. Brando increasingly took control of his own scenes, overruling Milestone on set, and at times refusing to follow his instructions entirely. Crew members would later describe long delays, while Brando debated details of his character or challenged decisions that had already been made. He was accused of arriving unprepared, changing scenes at the last minute, and refusing to perform when he disagreed with the material. Trevor Howard, who played Captain Bligh, offered perhaps the bluntest assessment. Brando, he said, could drive a saint to hell in a dog sled. But Brando was only one part of a production already coming apart. Heavy rains disrupted filming in Tahiti. The full-scale replica of the Bounty arrived months behind schedule, and the screenplay still was not finished. The production, which MGM had expected to take roughly 100 days, stretched on for well over a year, and the budget stretched with it. What had begun as one of MGM's great prestige projects became one of the most expensive films ever made. Milestone described the experience as like being in a hurricane on a rudderless ship without a captain. Richard Harris, who played Seaman John Mills, called it a total f***ing disaster. By the time Mutiny on the Bounty reached theaters in November 1962, the story of its troubled production had nearly overtaken the film itself. Reviews were mixed. Some admired the scale of the production and the beauty of its Tahitian locations. But Brando's performance, particularly the affected English accent he gave Fletcher Christian, drew widespread criticism. The film earned 7 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture. It won none. Financially, the film ranked among the highest-grossing films of the year. But after a production cost that had climbed to nearly $20 million, even that wasn't enough. MGM lost millions. and much of the blame settled on Brando. At the film's New York premiere, the hostility was impossible to miss. Howard received thunderous applause when he appeared on screen. Brando, when he appeared, was booed. And when the audience began laughing at his accent, he reportedly walked out. The damage to his reputation was real and increasingly difficult to dismiss. 2 productions in a row had gone wildly over budget and over schedule, with Brando at the center of both disasters. Brando was still one of the biggest stars in Hollywood, but something had changed. After One-Eyed Jacks and Mutiny on the Bounty, Brando had acquired a new reputation. Brilliant, perhaps, but difficult to control, expensive to indulge, and increasingly dangerous to build a film around. But for Brando, Mutiny on the Bounty left behind something more enduring than professional damage. Tahiti. From the moment he arrived, he was captivated by it. The landscape, the distance from Hollywood, the sense that life there moved according to values entirely separate from the industry he had spent years fighting. For Brando, Tahiti became more than a filming location. It became an escape. Mutiny on the Bounty also brought him Tarita Teriipaia. The young Tahitian actress had been cast as Mutiny, Fletcher Christian's love interest. And before filming was over, she had become Brando's as well. Brando was 36 when they met. Tarita was 18. For Brando, Tarita soon became inseparable from the life he imagined in Tahiti. Quieter, more private, and beyond the reach of the industry that had made him famous. Their relationship continued after production ended, and that imagined life would have to wait. Back in the United States, the relationships Brando had left behind were becoming increasingly difficult to contain. His affair with actress Rita Moreno had continued through his marriage to Anna Kashfi, his marriage to Movita, his first years as a father. Throughout, it had been marked by jealousy, infidelity, and repeated breakups and reconciliations. And also by something darker. Moreno had become pregnant sometime around 1960, and Brando, unwilling to acknowledge the child, unwilling to commit, had arranged an illegal abortion. It was botched. The fetus remained inside her and had to be surgically removed at a hospital. Brando's response, when he found out, was to express anger at the person who had performed it. But he wasn't there. He arranged for someone else to pick her up after the procedure. The recovery was painful, frightening, and solitary. When it was over, she went back to work. Back to filming what would be her Hollywood breakthrough, West Side Story. Brando left for Tahiti to film Mutiny on the Bounty and fell in love with Tarita. When he came back, Moreno was still there, still waiting. The end came shortly after. Moreno discovered Brando was involved with someone else. Again. She was staying at his house at the time. While he was out, she found his sleeping pills in the bathroom cabinet. She later wrote that she stood there for almost a half an hour before she swallowed them. "I went to bed to die," she wrote. "This wasn't a revenge suicide, but a consolation, an escape from pain, death." Brando's assistant found her unconscious and got her to the hospital in time. Afterward, a therapist who had worked with both of them urged them to end the relationship and stay away from each other. This time, they listened. After nearly 8 years, the relationship was over. By the time his relationship with Moreno ended, Brando's personal life had become almost impossible to map. He was still legally married to Movita, a marriage that was already beginning to come apart, even as she was raising their young son Miko. He was still locked in the bitter custody battle with Anna Kashfi over Christian. He was in love with Tarita, stealing whatever time he could in Tahiti, slipping away from the lawyers, the studios, the custody hearings, and the wreckage of 2 failed marriages whenever the world allowed it. And in 1963, Tarita gave birth to their son, Tehotu. 3 women, 1 increasingly complicated career, and 4 versions of himself, running simultaneously. But increasingly, what mattered most to Marlon Brando was something completely outside of all 4: the fight. On August 28, 1963, more than 250,000 people came to Washington, D.C. for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, to demand the rights the country had promised them but never fully delivered. They came by bus, by train, and by car from every part of the country, arriving before dawn, crowding the highways into Washington, and filling the National Mall from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial. The day was 77 degrees and humid. People stood in dresses, slacks, and ties despite the heat. Some sat along the edge of the reflecting pool with their feet in the water. Others spread blankets across the grass. Watching from the CBS anchor desk, Walter Cronkite described the crowd simply. They came from all over America, Negroes and whites, housewives and Hollywood stars, senators and a few beatniks. Near the Washington Monument, a temporary stage had been built for the morning's performances. Joan Baez sang, Bob Dylan sang, and by early afternoon, attention had turned toward the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. The final speaker was Martin Luther King Jr., the 34-year-old Baptist minister from Atlanta who had helped lead the Montgomery bus boycott, confronted segregation in Birmingham, and emerged as one of the central figures in a movement transforming the country. King described his dream of a country no longer divided by race. He spoke of children growing up in a nation where they would be judged by their character rather than the color of their skin. He called on America to fulfill promises of freedom and equality it had made but never kept. And he delivered one of the defining speeches in American history. Somewhere in that crowd of 250,000 people, standing in the August heat, was Marlon Brando. Brando had come as part of what was formerly called the Hollywood Delegation, roughly 50 actors and performers led by Charlton Heston and Harry Belafonte, which included Sidney Poitier, Paul Newman, Diane Carroll, and James Garner. But Brando's interest in the civil rights movement had not begun with the march. For years, he had been asking what any of it, the fame, the money, the influence, was for. He had tried to answer that question through the films he chose, pushing Sayonara toward a more defiant ending, searching for moral complexity in the young lions, imagining Pennebaker as a way to tell stories that mattered. But by the early 1960s, films no longer seemed like enough. Brando wanted to do something. Not just play a man confronting injustice, not just make a film about it. Something real. Among the people drawing Brando more deeply into the movement was one of his closest friends, James Baldwin, the Black writer and activist who had become one of the most important voices in America. The two men had known each other since the mid-1940s, when both were still finding their footing in New York. And as Baldwin wrote and spoke with increasing urgency about race, power, and the country's refusal to confront its own history, Brando listened. Sympathy no longer felt like enough. So he'd started putting money behind the causes he believed in, donating to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and helping establish a scholarship fund for the children of Medgar Evers, the Mississippi NAACP leader assassinated June 1963. But money, too, was beginning to feel like not enough. So on that August afternoon, surrounded by his Hollywood colleagues and standing beside his close friend James Baldwin, Brando listened as King asked the country to become something better than it had been. Later that day, he participated in a televised roundtable produced by the U.S. Information Agency, alongside Baldwin, Poitier, Belafonte, Heston, and director Joseph L. Mankiewicz. There, Brando pushed the conversation beyond the march itself. He argued that the struggle unfolding around Black civil rights might eventually force the country to confront another history of broken promises and dispossession: Native Americans. He spoke of reparations and of the possibility that one movement for justice might open the door to another. It was an early public expression of a concern Brando had carried for years. In 1955, he had read Indians of the Americas by John Collier, the former U.S. Commissioner of Indian Affairs, and it had changed the way he understood the country's history. The book revealed a history of stolen land, broken treaties, forced displacement, and promises the United States had repeatedly failed to keep, much of it absent from what Brando had been taught in school, in popular culture, and especially through Hollywood. It affected him deeply, and over the years that followed, Brando's interest deepened into commitment. Now, just as he had at the March on Washington, he was ready to do something about it. On March 2nd, 1964, Brando traveled to Washington State to join a protest on the Puyallup River. It was a fish-in, an act of civil disobedience in which protesters deliberately fished in waters the state claimed they had no right to use. The protest had been organized by Native activists fighting to defend rights guaranteed to them by treaty. Among those leading the effort was Puyallup activist Bob Satayacum, as well as members of the National Indian Youth Council. During the protest, Brando, along with Episcopal minister John Yarian, was arrested for suspicion of illegal fishing. Unlike the native fishermen alongside him, who argued that their treaty rights superseded state law, Brando, a white man, had no such defense. He was a non-native man fishing without a state license. But his arrest helped force the story into the national press. This is what Brando could offer: visibility, a famous name, and a willingness to place both his money and his celebrity behind people already doing the work. Over the years that followed, he continued contributing money, helping with legal costs and bail, and using his public profile to draw attention to civil rights and Native American causes. Increasingly, this was where Brando found the sense of purpose acting had failed to give him. But Hollywood still had claims on him. Claims that had, by this time, fully closed in around him. In 1961, Brando had signed a 5-picture deal with Universal. Not by choice. Well, not exactly. One-Eyed Jack's enormous cost overruns had left Pennebaker financially weakened, while the troubled production had badly damaged Brando's relationship with Paramount, the studio that had backed the company from the beginning. Without that support, Pennebaker could no longer continue as the independent production company Brando had imagined. That was when Universal stepped in, offering a lifeline to the struggling company, on the condition that Brando commit to 5 films for the studio. So the man who had built his career by avoiding long-term studio commitments now found himself locked into one, and the company he had created to free himself from Hollywood had instead bound himself more tightly to it. Over the next several years, the Universal agreement would keep Brando moving from one production to the next, but it would not keep him successful. The first film under the agreement was The Ugly American. Based on the best-selling novel by Eugene Burdick and William Lederer, it was the kind of project Brando still believed acting could be used for. He played Harrison Carter McWhite, an American ambassador sent to the fictional Southeast Asian nation of Sarkhan, where U.S. influence was being challenged by revolution. The film was openly political. It questioned American intervention overseas, and it criticized the arrogance of officials who believed money and power could substitute for understanding. For Brando, these concerns were not abstract. They reflected many of the same questions now shaping his life outside the studio. But conviction did not translate into success. When The Ugly American was released in 1963, reviews were mixed, and audiences stayed away. The first film in Brando's new contract failed at the box office. Bedtime Story came next in 1964, a light comedy opposite David Niven and Shirley Jones. Another disappointment. Morituri followed in 1965, this time with 20th Century Fox. Brando playing a German exile forced into an Allied espionage mission during the Second World War. Serious, expensive, and another commercial failure. In 1966 came The Chase, opposite Jane Fonda and Robert Redford, a troubled production, a film heavily altered before release, and an audience that, once again, stayed away. That same year, The Appaloosa, a Western, another difficult production, another forgettable film, and another box office bomb. Beyond the failures on screen, Brando's private life was in no better shape. In 1964, Anna Kashfi had lost custody of Christian after a judge determined that her drug and alcohol abuse made her unable to provide a stable home. But Christian didn't go to live with Brando. He went to live with Brando's aunt, raised largely by nannies, shuttled between adults who had agreed to take him. The pattern was not entirely unfamiliar. On July 17, 1965, Brando's father died. To friends, Brando appeared shaken during his father's final days. It wasn't grief exactly, something more complicated than that. The relationship had never healed. Now it never would. And in 1966, Movita, still his wife, in name at least, gave birth to their daughter, Rebecca, the product of a marriage that had, in any real sense, been over for years. Tahiti, by now, had become the closest thing Brando had to an escape. That same year, he made that escape a permanent part of his life. He bought Tetiaroa, a small atoll north of Tahiti. There, he could be closer to Tarita and their son, Tehotu, now about 3 years old. And he could begin building the life he had imagined ever since Mutiny on the Bounty, one removed from Hollywood and shaped on his own terms, even if, for now, Hollywood remained the thing paying for it. It was around this time that an offer came from Charlie Chaplin. By the mid-1960s, Chaplin had been living in exile for more than a decade. After the United States revoked his re-entry permit in 1952, amid growing suspicion over his left-wing politics and alleged communist sympathies, he settled with his family in Switzerland. Now, at 77, he was preparing A Countess from Hong Kong, his first film as a director in years. The production would be filmed in Britain, with Sophia Loren in the lead, and Chaplin wanted Brando to star opposite her. For Brando, the chance to work with one of cinema's defining figures, one who had built his career around the kind of creative independence Brando had spent years trying to achieve, was a no-brainer. He said yes. Any excitement about the collaboration faded soon after filming began. It was clear from the outset that what Chaplin wanted from his actors was precision. He would demonstrate exactly how he wanted a scene performed, then expect his actors to reproduce it. That approach didn't quite work with Brando. The two men clashed almost immediately and continued to do so throughout production. When A Countess from Hong Kong opened in 1967, the response was brutal. Critics savaged it. Audiences ignored it. And another film joined the growing list of Brando's failures. But 1967 also brought Reflections in a Golden Eye. Directed by John Huston and co-starring Elizabeth Taylor, the film cast Brando as Major Weldon Penderton, a deeply repressed army officer struggling with his attraction to men, his unhappy marriage, and the rigid masculine world he had built around himself. It was difficult material, quiet, uncomfortable. When it was released, it debuted at number 1. The commercial momentum faded quickly, but Brando received some of his strongest reviews in years. For a moment, at least, he reminded people what they had begun to forget beneath all the flops, production disasters, and increasingly indifferent work. The talent was still there. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis. Across the country, grief turned quickly into anger. Cities erupted in unrest, and millions of people were left confronting what the movement would become without one of its most important leaders. Brando had been preparing to star in The Arrangement, a new film directed by Elia Kazan. He withdrew from the production and announced that he intended to devote his time to the civil rights movement. King's death appeared to trigger a deeper reckoning in Brando, not only with the country, but with his own place in the movements he wanted to support. Appearing on the Joey Bishop show, he tried to put that uncertainty into words, explaining that King's death had forced him to confront how little he still understood about what Black people were facing in America. 8 days later, Brando attended Bobby Hutton's funeral in Berkeley. Hutton was a 17-year-old member and the first recruit of the Black Panther Party, killed by Oakland police during a confrontation 2 days after King's assassination. The Panthers said he had been shot while surrendering. Police gave a different account. Brando delivered a eulogy, then spoke at a rally attended by thousands. It's up to the individual to do something to force the government to give the Black man a decent place to live, a decent place to bring his children up in, he told the crowd. And I'm going to start right now to inform white people about what they don't know. The Reverend said the white man can't cool it because he's never dug it. And I'm here to try to dig it because I myself, as a white man, have a long way to go and a lot to learn. Susan Mizruki, who wrote one of the more serious academic assessments of Brando's life, put it carefully. Brando modeled, she said, a kind of social activism, the idea that actors were obligated, in some sense, to use their fame to help others. He showed up. He put his money where his mouth was, quite literally, and his name and his body on the line, alongside people already doing the work. His activism was not universally welcomed. Within Hollywood, Brando's political visibility made him a target, seen by some as grandstanding, by others as a man using other people's struggles to rehabilitate his own image. But in April 1968, at least, his public message was unambiguous. As a white man, he had more to learn than to teach. Meanwhile, Hollywood had reached a different verdict on Marlon Brando, one that had nothing to do with politics. In May 1968, Variety published a survey titled Rising Skepticism on Stars, asking whether some of Hollywood's highest-paid actors were still worth the money. Brando was one of the names at the center of it. His previous 6 films, the article noted, had generated just $8.4 million in total rentals, an average of roughly $1.6 million each. Not good. It wasn't a surprise. It was a confirmation. The pattern had been building for years, one flop at a time. Marlon Brando had become box office poison. His next films did little to dispel the label. In 1968 came Candy, a sprawling sex farce in which Brando appeared as a fraudulent Indian guru, later saying he made it because a friend had asked him. The night of the following day followed in 1969, a kidnapping thriller, the last of his Universal obligations. Brando said he made it only for the money. Both failed. Burn! Also in 1969, was different. An anti-colonial film about revolution, betrayal, and the machinery of empire. Brando genuinely believed in the project and in what it was trying to say. But it failed too. By the end of the 1960s, every part of Brando's life seemed to be pulling in a different direction. Privately, he remained divided between children, relationships, households, and obligations spread across different parts of the world. Politically, he seemed to have found the purpose he had been searching for all his life, even if he didn't yet know exactly where he fit within it. And professionally, it was rock bottom. The damage accumulated over years of resistance, conflict, and increasingly indifferent choices was impossible to ignore. The films had failed. The box office returns had collapsed. The stories of delays, cost overruns, conflict, and difficult productions had followed him from one set to the next. And the qualities that had once made Brando exciting, the refusal to obey, the instinct to challenge, the need to keep searching, had hardened into a reputation. Difficult, unpredictable, expensive, a risk. Hollywood no longer looked at Marlon Brando and saw the future. It saw someone who was a liability. Someone who had spent years slowly and systematically dismantling one of the most extraordinary careers Hollywood had ever seen. By 1969, the industry had all but made up its mind. Marlon Brando's career was effectively over. Then, in March of that year, a novel was published. A family drama built around loyalty, power, violence, and an aging patriarch struggling to hold it all together. And just like Marlon Brando himself had done almost 20 years earlier, it was about to turn the film industry upside down. That's a wrap on this week's episode of When They Were Making It, part 1 of our 3-part series on Marlon Brando. Next week, we'll explore the final act of Brando's life and career, from the comeback that reminded Hollywood of what he could do, through activism, excess, family tragedy, and the increasingly complicated legacy he left behind. I'm Patrick Rankin, writer, producer, and your host. Original artwork by Simone Beach, and original music by Lionel Zablat. Thank you for listening and for helping keep these stories alive. And now, our Patreon, The Backlot, is officially open at patreon.com/whentheyweremaking.it. You can join us there for bonus stories, episode companion extras, and members-only releases. Our full-length bonus episode for June, a look at Barbara Stanwyck, the woman Hollywood couldn't break, is out now for Studio Insider members. There are also mini-episodes on classic Hollywood stories like the studio-era world of central casting, the mysterious death of 1930s comedian Thelma Todd, and more, along with companion after-shows for each main feed subject and monthly Q&A extras. And that's just what's waiting for you from June. July's backlot releases are on the way, with a new round of all of it, including a full-length episode on the elusive and elegant Grace Kelly for Studio Insider members. You'll find the backlot at patreon.com/whentheyweremaking.it, or through the link in the show notes. We also post a companion piece for each episode on Instagram. Images, context, the visual side of the story. We're When They Were Making It on Instagram and TikTok. And if you're enjoying the show, please follow us in whatever app you're listening in. It means every new episode lands automatically, and it's the clearest signal to Apple and Spotify that these stories are finding an audience. But the honest truth is, a show like this doesn't grow on ads or algorithms. It grows because one person hears it and tells another. So if this was worth your time, tell someone. That does more than anything else. Until next time, keep watching. And remember, behind every great film is an even greater story.